इंस्टीट्यूशनल स्ट्रक्चर पैदा करने पैने आ जिन्हां नाल साडे संघर्ष की गल अगे तुर सके। सो सानू गल समझनी पैनी है कि कंटैंपरेरी वर्ल्ड पॉलिटिक्स खड़ी कित्थे आ ते साडा रोल की बनदा, किहो जे काम सानू करने पैने आ जिन्हां नाल सानू ये आज़ादी प्राप्त होनी आ। सो हुण प्रोफैसर इंदिरा परास्त जिहड़े ह्यूमन राइट्स एक्टिविस्ट ने ते नाल फ्रीलांस जर्नलिस्ट भी ने ते सिखां दे उत्ते सिखां दे पोलीटिकल मसलियां दे उत्ते बहुत लंबे समय तो वो रिसर्च कर रहे ने। वो एक पेपर प्रजेंट करनगे जिहदे विच वो तुहाडे नाल इह गल शेयर करनगे कि भाई बलवंत सिंह राजोआणा ने जिहड़ा इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन नूं मन्नण तो इनकार कीता, इंडियन जुडिशियल सिस्टम नूं मन्नण तो इनकार कीता, ਉਹਦੇ असल च मीनिंग की आ, ਉਹਦੇ डीपर मीनिंग की आ। क्योंकि जिन्ना चਿਰ ਅਸੀਂ चीज़ां ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਡੂੰਘਾ नहीं ਲੈਂਦੇ, जिन्ना ਚਿਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਨਹੀਂਗੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਚਿਰ ਸਾਡੀ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ ਰਾਹ ਤਿਆਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣਗੇ। क्योंकि ਜਿਹੜੀ नारे लाने आ ਜਿਹੜੇ मैं इन्हां दे बिल्कुल अगेंस्ट नहीं गा, नारे सानू लाने चाहिए आ, हमेशा लाने चाहिए आ, पर इन्हां तो अगे भी तुरना चाहिए। असीं पिछले 27 सालों तो नारियां ते अटके खड़े आ, इसे करके संघर्ष आ जिहड़ा वो अगे वधण दी थां ते होर गरक गया। सो सानू गल समझनी चाहिए है। सो बेनती है कि जदों इंदिरा परास्त अपना पेपर प्रजेंट करनगे उन्होंने बहुत ध्यान नाल सुनिया जाए ते विच कोई भी जिहड़ा रौला ना पाया जाए। सो थैंक यू वेरी मच। नाउ आई विल कॉल इंदिरा परास्त टू प्रेजेंट।
One wears many hats, and in fact Amnesty International representative has been delayed to speak. He just is on his way here from Calgary, so I have now I'm taking the stand to speak. It's quite overwhelming to see so many Sikhs here today and having freedom to express themselves. What I want to talk about is, first of all, to highlight that what I speak about is not just cerebral. It actually comes from a lot of witnessing, and it is connected to different forms of identity. When I was in Vancouver, I used to go to the Vaisakhi parades, and many people used to say that the slogans that we're seeing here are in fact propaganda and there are no human rights in India. And what touched me is when I saw a film involving, it was called Amu, and I met Sonali Bose, who was the filmmaker of that film. And I tried to show that at Langara College, and there was so much opposition by mainstream, and it's exactly because of this opposition that I chose to show the film, because I noted that there was something not settling. And so in commemorating 25 years, I went to Tilak Vihar, I went to Punjab, I also interviewed Khalistani leaders and representatives all over North America and in various parts, and I've just returned from Pakistan. So I'm coming here really in solidarity to say that human rights issues are really not a figment of the imagination. In fact, it is even worse than what is even being represented right here. When we look at Sikhs, we have to understand that their relationship to a state is one where they are a minority. And what I would like to illuminate today is that the human rights violations continue in labeling Sikhs as terrorists, and how this representation is hypocritical because India also engages in state terrorism. Why does that get eclipsed? And this, in fact, allows the Indian state to sustain itself. Today in the global world, we have imperialism and corporate capitalism. Canada is also aligning itself with India, and it doesn't serve Canada to align itself with a country that violates human rights. So it is a battle to expose it. When we look at Sikhs, we have to recognize that the Sikh history has never been one that has been calm. There have been ebbs and flows of conflict, and the conflict has always been rooted in upholding Sikh identity, their faith, or resisting oppression in the Indian state. And if we actually go into the dialectics here between the Mughal empires, British colonialism, and more recently, when we look at the Indian nation state, we can see similar patterns of Sikhs protecting their faith. And so when we look at a history that resonates with many of us, 1984, preceding Operation Blue Star, we don't get in a mainstream the real story, the context that Sikhs actually were experiencing enormous inequality, which is what led to resisting the state, and then a response by the Indian state with Operation Blue Star, and then a resistance that took place in the context of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And then we have the Delhi genocide. So all of these particular histories need a context, and Sikhs in Canada, in my research, have been absolutely robbed of it. When we look at bhai Balwant Singh's case, people have no context and right away say he's a terrorist, when there hasn't even been any proof of the allegations. So what I feel that needs to be illuminated is that we have to start to bring back the Sikh history, the context, and then let people decide whether Sikhs are the terrorists, whether they in fact are the instigators of violence. A very famous post-colonialist, Frantz Fanon, always said that colonialism in fact is met by decolonization, and that is when there is a violent resistance, it is a resistance to the first instance of violence, and that is the colonizers. So when we have people taking arms in the Golden Temple, it is a response to the first instance of violence. Let's not forget that context. The media eclipsing of state violence is actually a global phenomenon. When we look at the United States, we don't see them as state terrorists because the media does not expose it. But in fact, when you look at the numbers, it may shock you. It'll shock you because we aren't exposed to that on the front page of media. I'm citing sources from Galtug and Fisher that said that since 1947, the US has intervened abroad 67 times, resulting in 12 million deaths, half by the Pentagon and the other half by the CIA. And so, when we look at Indian state terrorism, defined here where a state is actually engaging in violence on its own people, why do we not hear about that? I spent 8 years doing research and content analysis on how Sikhs have been represented, and that will come out very soon. It has been systematically eclipsed. Without this context, Operation Blue Star, November genocide, and the Khalistan movement loses its political and historical significance, and this allows the Indian state to reproduce its ideology, which is, again, one nation, very much dominated by a Hindu-centric world and vision. So what we have to also look at is what strategies does the Indian state employ to sustain its powers, to get away with violence, with impunity. One of the strategies has often been to overshadow the Sikh genocide and to use the word riot. Because when you use the word riot, it totally deflects from the state-involved premeditated actions and, in fact, the role that Congress played in, the information is on the internet, it's beyond me to go into it, but the state was very clearly involved. And the reason why it's not in the interest of India to acknowledge genocide is because it is the one condition by the United Nations that allows military intervention to come into that nation. And it doesn't benefit India today in its burgeoning of being part of the world imperialist structure that is occurring. The genocidal violence has been very well documented. Last November, I was in Toronto and Amnesty International represented some statistics, and I want to show you that this is what is being reported, not by average organizations, by very reputable organizations. They said the Indian government failed to uphold many of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They drew on more than 8 articles. Article 3, everyone has the liberty to security. Article 5, no one should be subject to torture. In fact, they said the Indian government only filed 586 criminal wrongdoings after the massacre. And in fact, they also further stated, quote, that it is a national disgrace that those responsible for the massacre have not been brought to justice. This is coming from Amnesty International, and I do have to say that they have stood in solidarity on various fronts to expose those human rights. So I do encourage you to go on that website. So my question to you is, we have the facts. What are Sikhs to do? What are Sikhs to do? Those who challenge the state as a collective are brutally punished. And when I was in Amritsar, in many cases you hear stories where people are silent because they know the violence that was inflicted on their bodies by the Indian state. And they continue to be dehumanized. And I want to speak about torture, because that's exactly how the state responds to people that espouse ideologies that work against the Indian nation state. When we look at other reports of human rights, according to the Asian Center for Human Rights, taking 2000 as a base year, according to the UPA government, it included that 70% of an increase in death in prison custody and a 12% increase in police custody. There have been huge lobbies to actually engage India to have a public debate on the prevention of the torture bill. So this is not a baseless allegation when you're hearing people with these slogans out there saying torture. These are facts. So I want to develop this a little bit, and I want you to understand the larger significance of this brutal violence, especially in the context of India's nation building today. Torture is a powerful tool because it allows many individuals to show their power. And so, in fact, when you engage in torture, you are inflicting pain and power. And that is a stamp of the Indian state. It is a stamp of any government that wants to silence and control a people. And Khalistani Sikhs and the militants, when you look at different forms of torture, it was absolutely brutal. And I'm not saying one torture is more or less brutal, but it was exceptionally brutal. When I met a militant, he told me about his torture. And what he said, and it speaks to the point that I want to make, this torture also means control over the Sikh mind, or a person's mind, where you are tortured to a point where you squeal and don't accept your own ideology. What this Sikh militant told me is when they saw a picture of Bhai Singh, who also is a martyr along with Binwalal in the time, they asked him, why you have his picture? And he said, he's my martyr. They tortured him. And then they went and showed the picture and said, who is he? He said, he is a martyr for the Sikhs. And they continued to torture him for a month. And he knew there is a whole science in torture where you know exactly what muscles to move to make the pain more excruciating. The fact remains is what he held on to was the history of Sikhs and how gurus endured as well. And if they could, why can't Sikhs today? And this is exactly why Sikhs constitute a threat to any nation. Because it is in their Sikhi, it is in their Gurbani, it is in their history that you speak against violence. That's exactly why Sikh history is being systematically erased, because history and the role modeling from gurus constitutes a threat to the state. This also applies to Bhai balwant, because in many ways his motives were also justified in the context of how he viewed human rights violations. And so today, Sikhs are really struck with huge barriers to raise their voice because of geopolitical climates. We have raised the double standards that are in place. Do you know how painful it is to go to vigils for November and have media and others say that this is human rights propaganda, when one can clearly see the huge impact it's had on Sikh families? And when I was in Tilak Tihar, many of the widows, it is beyond words for me to tell you how they're living. We can only imagine it. It's frustrating when my mother, who's also a professor with the Genocide Institute, advocates for the Jewish community on genocide. The Jewish community have a very good platform, and she has lobbied for them. So where is the platform for when people want to lobby for Sikhs exposing a genocide? The difference in my experience with my mother is that when she goes back to Germany, she's welcome in her home country. I'm half German. When I go back to India, after I had written about my experience with the widows in Tilak Vihar, I was not given my visa. I had to sign particular conditions. What kind of democracy is that as a Canadian, to be able to go back as an academic? I shake my head and I say shame on the Indian state. And they should start to own up, really, to who they are, because we are now on a global movement exposing what has been silenced for so long. And I really feel like saying Khalistan Zindabad at this moment. Khalistan Zindabad! Because this has been stigmatized. And I want to talk about that very briefly. Since Air India, since 9/11, this has been the systematic tool used by the state to prevent any kind of human rights issue to be exposed. I want to cite my mother, Dr. Karen Dare, who says, with bitterness and emotion, the use of Nazi language was used as a weapon of destruction against the Jewish community. When you have dehumanized a person, it is easier to inflict pain on them. It is easier to dispose of their bodies. And it is important to recognize when we talk about terrorism, we have to ask who's in power, because those people in power